Okay, let's pick up where we left off with square root of negative 8. So you probably wrote it as square root of negative 1 times square root of 8. So that would be I square root of 8. That's fine. But it can actually be simplified further. So right over here, I have the factors of 8, which would be 1 times 8 and 2 times 4. Of these numbers, I want to know which one is a perfect square. Meaning, if I take the square root of it, I will get a whole number. So like square root of 1 is 1. That one worked. If you type in square root of 8, you get a decimal. That one doesn't work. Okay, let's try square root of 2. You type in square root of 2, you get a decimal. That one doesn't work. Okay, let's do square root of 4. You get 2, a whole number. That one works. So we have 1 and 4 that worked. Well, which one's larger? Okay, because 4 is a larger number, we're going to use these two as factors. So right here, this square root of 8, we're going to rewrite as square root of 2 times square root of 4. Well, square root of 2, like we said earlier, is a decimal, so I'm just going to leave it as square root of 2. Square root of 4 we found to be 2. So bring this back over here. We have 3 terms. We have square root of 2, we have 2, and then don't forget we also had that I from the original problem. So notation, which we'll talk more about tomorrow, notation should be the real number, so that's 2, then the imaginary, then the square root. So this would actually be your final answer, 2 times I times square root of 2. So let's do more practice with that on page 123. So these are done for you in your book. So I'm going to talk through them, and I just want you to follow along. So first we have the square root of negative 17. So look here, another way to write negative 17 is a negative 1 and a positive 17. Well, we now know square root of negative 1 is really just I. Square root of 17, well, if you type that in your calculator, you get a decimal, so just leave it. So it goes I square root of 17. That would be the final. You're done. So let's look at another one. Let's look at the square root of negative 9. So square root of negative 9 means we have square root of negative 1 times square root of 9. Okay, square root of negative 1. We now know that's just I. Square root of 9. We'll type in your calculator. It's a perfect square. What do you get? You get 3. So I times 3 is your final. Well, remember the notation. We always put the real number or whole number first. So this 3 should really go first. Then the I. Then if we had a radical, we'd put it. So right here, over in the side, I have the notation for writing the math. So right here's our notation. So go ahead and jot that down. So it should go whole number, then times the I, then times the square root of whatever number. This is notation you use every single time. So let's practice a couple. So let's look at the square root of negative 25. So this means we have the square root of negative 1 times the square root of 25. Well, square root of negative 1 is I. Square root of 25 is 5. Is this in the correct notation? No, it's not. We need to rearrange so that it's 5i. That would be our final. So now I want you to try part B. So in part B, you saw it was square root of negative 1 times square root of 7. So it's I square root of 7. Square root of 7 cannot be simplified any further. So it's just I square root of 7. That would be your final. Okay, let me show you another one. Let's look at C. Square root of negative 12. Okay, so we have square root of negative 1 times square root of 12. So you may be tempted just to write this as I square root of 12. So this is correct, except it needs to be simplified further, similar to an example that we just saw. So 12. Let's list the factors of 12. 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. So which of these are perfect squares? Notice we can take the square root of 1 and we get 1. Square root of 12, we get a decimal. Square root of 2, we get a decimal. Square root of 6, we get a decimal. Square root of 3, decimal. Square root of 4, 2. Which one's larger between 1 and 4? 4. So instead of writing this as square root of 12, we can write this as square root of 3 times 4. So we have square root of 3 times square root of 4. Well, we know square root of 4 is 2. So we have square root of 3 times 2. So right here, where we have square root of 12, we really have square root of 3 times 2. And notice that I is just out in front. So remember our notation, the correct notation. So notice the notation. How would we need to rewrite? What term comes first? So the final answer should be 2, then I, then square root of 3. Now you're done. Now that you've seen that example, I want you to try part D. So on part D, we know it's going to have an imaginary, so it's I square root of 150. I want you to now simplify this square root of 150. List the factors, and then write the final answer. So if you're struggling with factors, then what I want you to do is take the number, so like 125, divide it by perfect square. So the first perfect square is 1. Okay, well that one will work. Okay, what about if we try to divide it by 4? Notice we get a decimal. That one doesn't work. Okay, now let's try 9. Get a decimal. Okay, doesn't work. Let's try 16. Notice I'm plugging in the values that are perfect squares. I have perfect squares projected in the front of the room above the calculator where it says perfect squares. So 16 doesn't work. So let's try the next one. Let's try 25. Notice 25 worked. Okay, so this is how you can get the factors. So I think in this problem, we want 150. So we do 150. Same process. We divide it by 1. Okay, that one worked. Divide it by 4. Didn't work. Just keep dividing it by perfect squares. 16 didn't work. Let's try 25. See how 25 worked. That's how I got 25 and 6 right here. So we can now write this as square root of 25 times square root of 6. Well, square root of 25 is just 5. Square root of 6 is a decimal. Just leave it how it is. So here we have I times 5 times the square root of 6. Is this in the correct notation? No, it's not. So you want to rearrange it so that it's 5i square root of 6. That would be your final. Okay, the last thing we're going to look at is identifying real versus imaginary parts in a complex number. So let's go back to those two roots that we had earlier, where we had x equals 5 plus the square root of negative 15. Well, we can now write that knowing that this term right here has a negative. We can now write that as an imaginary. So 5 plus I square root of 15 would be that 1x. Okay, the other x, 5 plus minus the square root of negative 15. Instead of negative 15, we know that there is an I term there. Okay, so these two parts, this 5, these are both real numbers. So these are the real parts. The parts with the I, those are the imaginary. So be able to identify a real, which are the whole numbers, and the imaginaries, which have the I's.